Good evening, and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Let tonight begin very slowly, like a small lamp being lit behind an old window, its soft golden light falling gently across a wooden table, across quiet pages, and into the stillness of a room far away from the noise of the day. Outside, the wind moves past low rooftops, dark trees, and a misty village road, carrying only the faintest whisper of the night. You do not need to hurry into the story. You do not need to remember anything. Simply rest here for a while, inside this quietness, and let each sentence pass by slowly, like warmth spreading through a room where the fire has been left to burn low. And as the story opens, softly and gently, you may allow your eyes to grow heavy, your breathing to slow, and your thoughts to drift toward a calmer place. Thomas Elwood had been a gardener for so long that, in the villages around Ashcombe, there were people who had never known him as anything else. Long before his back had bent a little beneath the years, long before the silver in his hair had thinned to a soft white around his temples, long before his hands had grown stiff in cold weather and slow to open in the morning, he had come to Ashcombe Hall as a young apprentice with a borrowed coat, a pair of boots too large for him, and a nervous respect for every locked gate, every glasshouse pane, every border laid out with a care he did not yet understand. He had been 16 then, quiet even as a boy, with a face more suited to listening than speaking, and an instinctive tenderness for growing things that no one had needed to teach him: soil, weather, leaf, root, rain, frost, and the small patient labor by which a garden holds itself together had become his education. Now he was 72, and the garden had outlasted nearly everything else. It had outlasted his youth. It had outlasted the old head gardener who first taught him how to sharpen a pruning knife, how to judge a seedling without rushing it, how to read the color of the sky before trusting the forecast of any man. It had outlasted the first tremor in his heart when Agnes came to Ashcombe as a housemaid, carrying linen through the kitchen yard, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a laugh that seemed always to arrive quietly, as if she had chosen not to disturb the morning. It had outlasted their marriage, their little cottage near the lower orchard, the years when Marion was small enough to run beside the brick wall and ask the names of flowers without waiting for the answers, and the years after that, when she grew taller, quieter, more impatient with the stillness that Thomas had mistaken for peace. Ashcombe Hall itself stood some distance behind the station that evening, beyond the darkening fields and the lane that bent past the churchyard. But Thomas could still feel it with the accuracy of a man who had known every path by foot. He could have walked through the old walled garden in memory, even with his eyes shut. The south-facing brick still holding the day's warmth long after sunset, the gravel path pale under mist, the glass house roof beaded with rain, the potting shed with its faint smell of twine, damp sacking, clay pots, and leaf mold. There had been pear trees trained flat against one wall, espaliered so long ago that their branches seemed more like calligraphy than wood. There had been herb beds edged with box, a dipping tank near the greenhouse door, and rose beds that opened in June with the soft exhaustion of old beauty, not bright, not showy, but deep with years. For most of his life, Thomas had believed that if a thing was cared for faithfully enough, it would remain. Not unchanged, exactly, for no gardener was foolish enough to expect that. A garden was never still. It moved through swell and fading, through cutting back and renewal, through leaf fall, rot, frost, bud, and bloom. But beneath all that movement, there had always been a pattern, a return, a promise that what disappeared in November might come again in May if the roots had been kept safe. Thomas had lived by that belief with a steadiness that had once seemed almost religious to Agnes, though she had only smiled and said he spoke more gently to seedlings than to visitors. But Ashcombe Hall had been sold. The new owners had walked the grounds with rolled plans beneath their arms and polite voices that did not know where to soften. They had spoken of opening the view, improving the approach, reducing unnecessary maintenance, replacing old structures, making the gardens less demanding, more modern, more suited to the future. They had admired certain things in passing, the way strangers admire heirlooms in a house they have already decided to alter. One of them had stood before the south wall and asked whether the roses were very old, and Thomas had answered yes, very old, though what he had meant was that Agnes had stood there in a blue apron one June morning with Marion in her arms, and that the old master's wife had once cut blooms from that bed for the church, and that he himself had tied those canes through summers of sorrow, frost, illness, and ordinary weather. But the gentleman had only nodded and made a note. There had been no cruelty in it. That was almost the hardest part. No one had struck the wall in anger, or cursed the roses, or laughed at the glass houses. There had been only signatures, estimates, new intentions, and the calm, efficient language by which one life is cleared away to make room for another. Thomas had been thanked for his years of service. A small arrangement had been made. His cottage was no longer his. His wages would end. The tools that belonged to the estate were to remain in the shed, cleaned and hung as usual, and Thomas, who had always known where he was needed before sunrise, found himself a man with no official reason to return at all. That last afternoon, he had gone through the garden slowly, though he had told himself he was only checking things in the proper manner. He had closed the cold frames. He had fastened the greenhouse latch. He had brushed soil from the potting bench with the side of his hand. He had stood at the south wall longer than was necessary, looking at the bare rose canes where Ashcombe blush had once flowered in pale, almost translucent pink, its petals carrying the faintest warmth of apricot at the center, as if dawn had been folded into them. The original plant had failed after the hard winter 2 years before, but Thomas had saved what he could. Cuttings had not taken. One small root had blackened, yet from the last hips gathered before the frost, there remained a little store of seeds, wrapped in paper, labeled in his own hand, and kept inside a cloth bag Agnes had sewn many years earlier from a remnant of old ticking. The bag was in his coat pocket now. It was a humble thing, small enough to fit in his palm, the stitches uneven where Agnes had worked by lamplight in the cottage kitchen. She had made it for twine at first, then for labels, then for whatever Thomas needed and forgot to name. After she died, he had kept it because her hands had known it. Later, without quite deciding to, he had placed the Ashcombe blush seeds inside, and the bag had become the one thing in the garden he did not hang on a peg or set on a shelf. It stayed close to him, as if the last fragile argument for continuity had to be carried near the heart. He had packed little else: a leather satchel with a shirt, a pair of stockings, his spectacles, a worn razor, a folded photograph of Agnes, and a rose notebook with penciled dates, weather marks, pruning observations, failed grafts, bloom counts, and small comments no one else would find useful. His trunk, already sent ahead to the luggage van, held a Sunday coat, 2 waistcoats, and the few books he had not given away. He had left behind the large things, because large things belonged to houses, and he no longer had one. What he carried with him belonged to the hand. By the time he reached the station, the evening had settled low and cold. The platform was washed in yellow gaslight and white steam. Moisture clung to the iron ribs of the roof and gathered along the glass panes overhead, where the last grey of the sky had faded into a dim, wet shine. The lamps burned inside cloudy globes, each one making a trembling circle of warmth on the platform boards, while between them the shadows remained blue and deep. Steam drifted from the engine in slow folds, curling around boots, trunks, milk churns, and the wheels of luggage barrows before thinning upward into the rafters. The smell of damp coal hung heavily in the air, mixed with wool, rain, cold metal, and the faint sharpness of oil. Thomas stood near the carriage door, with his ticket folded between 2 fingers. Around him, the station moved in small, necessary ways. A porter pushed a barrow of trunks past, with a hollow wooden rattle. A woman adjusted the scarf of a sleeping child. 2 men beneath the clock murmured over a newspaper, their voices lowered by the lateness of the hour. Somewhere ahead, the engine breathed with a deep iron patience, and every breath it gave seemed to remind Thomas that this was not a visit, not an errand, not one of those journeys from which a man returns after a few days with a parcel and a story. This train was carrying him away because there was nowhere left at Ashcombe for him to stay. He was going to Ludlow, to Marion. The thought should have comforted him. She was his daughter, after all, his only child, living now in a small house near the town, with a husband Thomas barely knew, and children he had seen only in stiff photographs. She had written kindly when the news came that he must leave, and there had been no hesitation in her offer. "Come to us, father," she had written. "There is room." Yet kindness did not remove the long silence between them. Marion had left Ashcombe years ago, not in anger exactly, but with the firm brightness of someone who knew she would suffocate if she stayed. Thomas had not understood it then. A garden, to him, had been a place of shelter. To Marion, perhaps, it had been a wall. He had mistaken her leaving for refusal. Worse, he had allowed that mistake to harden. Now he was traveling toward her with a satchel, a tired body, and a little bag of seeds from a garden she might not wish to remember. The guard called down the platform. Doors began closing one by one, their wooden frames giving firm, final sounds. Thomas lifted himself into the carriage with more care than he would have liked, and found his compartment empty. It was warmer inside, close with the smell of old upholstery, leather straps, coal heat, and damp coats. The seats were covered in dark fabric, worn smooth by years of travelers. Heavy curtains hung beside the windows, drawn back enough to show the cold glass, already misting at the edges. A brass hook waited above the seat. The lamp overhead gave a modest yellow light that trembled slightly, though the train had not yet begun to move. Thomas placed his satchel beside him, then took off his coat and laid it across his knees, keeping one hand over the pocket where the cloth bag rested. Outside the window, the platform lamps floated in the steam, blurred and doubled by the glass. For a moment, his own reflection appeared among them, an old man seated beneath a railway lamp, hat in hand, shoulders narrow beneath his dark coat, face lined by weather and patience, and a grief too quiet to announce itself. Then the whistle sounded. It was not sharp, but low and long, and the station seemed to hold itself still around it. The engine pulled. A shudder passed through the floor, through the seat, through Thomas's knees and hands. For several seconds the movement was so slight that it felt like a thought rather than a fact. Then the platform began to slide backward. The bench, the porter, the lamps, the clock under the iron roof, all drifted away with a smoothness that made the leaving feel almost gentle. Thomas watched without moving. The station lights stretched into pale golden lines. The figures lost their faces. The roof gave way to open darkness. Beyond the glass, the night widened into black fields, wet hedges, and the occasional small window of a cottage burning far off like a coal under ash. The wheels found their rhythm beneath him, steady and soft, iron answering iron, as the train gathered itself and carried him westward. Ashcombe was behind him now, in a way it had not been before, not merely behind a closed gate, or beyond a lane, or at the other end of a road he might walk again if he chose. It was falling away by miles. The garden, the glass houses, the brick wall, the gravel paths, the rose beds, the potting shed, the cottage where Agnes had once lit the evening lamp, the path where Marion had run as a child, all of it seemed to recede together into the dark, becoming less a place he could reach than a life he had already lived. He did not weep. Thomas Elwood had never been a man who offered his sorrow outwardly, but his hand closed slowly over the little cloth bag, through the fabric of his coat, and something in him softened with the helplessness of soil after rain. The seeds were small, almost weightless, yet they lay against him, as though they contained every summer he had kept, every loss he had not spoken, and the last pale bloom of a garden that had no further need of its gardener. The train moved on into the night. Ahead lay Ludlow. Ahead lay Marion. And Thomas, who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly where each route belonged, sat quietly in the warm compartment and felt himself carried toward a place where he did not yet know how to take hold. The compartment settled around Thomas with the slow intimacy of a room that belonged to no one and had nevertheless received many private sorrows. After the station had slipped away into darkness, and the last blurred lamps had vanished behind the misted glass, there remained only the warm, enclosed hush of the carriage, the muted yellow light above him, and the steady turning of the wheels beneath the floor. The train no longer seemed to be leaving so much as continuing, carrying him through the night, with a patience that did not ask whether he was ready. The seat opposite him was empty. Its dark fabric showed the polished softness of long use, worn smooth where shoulders and elbows had rested through years of winter journeys, market mornings, late returns, and quiet departures. Above it, a brass luggage rack caught a thin line of lamplight. Beside the window, the heavy curtain trembled very slightly each time the carriage leaned into the curve of the track. The little lamp overhead swung almost imperceptibly, making the shadows shift along the varnished wood panels like water moving beneath ice. It was warmer inside than Thomas had expected. A low heat rose from beneath the seat, and gathered around his boots, softening the cold that had followed him from the platform. His knees, stiff from the damp evening, began to loosen a little. His hands, which had closed too tightly around his ticket and satchel strap, rested now upon his folded coat. Yet the warmth did not comfort him at once. It only made him more aware that he had entered a world between places. Neither Ashcombe nor Ludlow, neither the life behind nor the one ahead, but a narrow, moving shelter where a man might sit with everything he had not yet understood. Outside the window, the glass had grown pale with breath and cold. At its edges, small beads of moisture gathered and joined, slipping downward in slow, crooked lines. The world beyond was nearly invisible. Now and then, a farm light appeared far off across the fields, hovered for a moment like a small fixed star, and then disappeared behind the black line of a hedge or the sudden blur of a cutting. Once, the train passed a row of trees, so close to the track that their branches showed briefly against the sky, thin and leafless, like dark writing on a slate. Then they were gone too. Thomas listened. The sound of the train was not one sound, but many folded together. There was the deep, even pulse of the wheels, iron meeting iron in a rhythm that seemed to lengthen the night. Beneath it came the occasional wooden creak of the carriage frame, the soft complaint of leather straps, the whisper of the curtain moving against the panel, and from somewhere farther along the train, a faint cough, then silence again. At intervals, the wind pressed against the door with a low breath, found some narrow place near the latch, and entered as a thin thread of cold air. From the next compartment came the delicate sound of paper being turned. Someone was reading a newspaper by lamplight, slowly, perhaps only to keep awake. The pages gave a dry, familiar rustle, and for a moment Thomas thought of the papers that had arrived at Ashcombe Hall in earlier years, folded sharply on silver trays, damp at the corners if the footman had crossed the yard in rain. The great house had seemed permanent then, with its breakfast room, its bells, its servants' passages, its rooms opening one into another, as if the very building believed in continuance. Yet even houses, he knew now, were not roots. They could pass from hand to hand like books. He drew the cloth bag from his coat pocket and placed it carefully on his knee. For a long while, he did not open it. It lay there, under the yellow lamp, small and plain, made from faded ticking that had once been blue and cream, but had softened now into a colour almost without name. Agnes's stitches ran along the side, in uneven, patient lengths. He remembered watching her sew it at the kitchen table one evening, after rain, her head bent, the lamplight resting on the brown curve of her hair. She had not made a ceremony of it. Agnes had never made ceremonies out of useful things. She had only asked him whether he wanted a drawstring or a flap, and when he had said either would do, she had smiled and told him that was how men ended up with inconvenient pockets. That had been more than 30 years ago. Thomas touched the edge of the bag with one finger. The fabric gave softly beneath his skin. Inside, the paper packet made the faintest dry sound, no louder than a dead leaf shifting in a border. He thought of the seeds lying there, small, hard, and secret, carrying within themselves some hidden memory of colour. Ashcombe blush. Even the name seemed too delicate for the cold train and the dark country rushing past the window. It belonged to June light on brick, to the low hum of bees, to the first unfolding petals after days of warm rain. The rose had never been a grand one. Visitors had often preferred the newer varieties near the main walk, deeper red, fuller, more impressive when cut for the house. Ashcombe blush had been quieter, its blooms pale and loose, almost shy at the edges, with a fragrance that did not declare itself until one stood near the wall in the morning. Thomas had loved it for that. Agnes had too, though she would have said she liked it because it did not try to outshine the other flowers. In her last spring, when she was already slower on the path and often needed to rest by the dipping tank, she had asked him to cut one bloom and set it in the small brown jug beside her chair. He had done so without speaking. For 3 days, the room had held that faint rose scent. The carriage gave a sudden sway, and Thomas steadied the bag with his hand. Outside, the train entered a deeper stretch of countryside where there were no lights at all. The window became a dark mirror. In it, he saw the compartment reflected around him, the opposite seat, the brass rack, the dim lamp, his own face lowered toward his knees. He saw how old he looked, not simply old in years, for he had known his age well enough each time he rose from kneeling beside a bed or climbed the glass-house steps with more care than before, but old in the particular way of a man removed from his proper setting. In the garden, his bent shoulders had belonged to the work. His slow hands had meant experience. His silence had been understood by paths, tools, seasons, and birdsong. Here, beneath the lamp, he was only an old man on a night train, carrying seeds no one had asked for. He let his hand rest over the bag and closed his eyes. The rhythm of the wheels changed slightly, becoming softer as the train crossed a stretch of level track. And in that steadier sound, Ashcombe rose before him with such clarity that for a moment the carriage seemed to fall away. He was back in the walled garden just after rain, when the brick paths were darkened to a deeper red and the air smelled of wet earth, box leaves, and the warm mineral breath of the old wall. The glass-house door stood open. Drops slipped from the roof in bright beads and struck the stone threshold one by one. Somewhere near the bean rows, a robin moved in the soil he had turned that morning, and from beyond the wall came the soft, distant clatter of the stable yard. He could see the rose beds before their alteration, when the central path still curved in the old fashion, and the labels were written by hand on zinc plates that weathered to a dull grey. He remembered the ache in his fingers after winter pruning, the numbness that crept into the thumb and forefinger, the satisfying clean angle of a good cut above an outward-facing bud. He remembered tying canes with raffia while frost still lingered in the shaded corners. He remembered the first swelling of red leaf buds, the green flush of April, the nervous watch for black spot after damp weeks, the relief when June came full and mild, and Marion. The memory arrived gently at first, as memories of children often do, not as a complete scene but as movement. A small girl in a brown wool dress running ahead of him along the gravel path, her boots scattering stones, her hair coming loose from its ribbon. She had loved the sound of the greenhouse door sliding open and the strange, damp warmth inside. She had asked why seedlings leaned toward the light, why worms came up after rain, why roses had thorns if they were meant to be beautiful. Thomas had answered as well as he could, though often too seriously for a child. Agnes had once told him, laughing softly, that Marian did not always want a lecture. Sometimes she only wanted her father to wander with her. There had been a summer when Marian followed him everywhere. She carried a small basket with nothing in it but a broken label, 3 feathers, and a stone she claimed looked like a sleeping cat. She had stood beside him while he watered the young plants and had solemnly informed each one that it must grow well because her father had asked it to. Thomas had thought then that the garden was entering her as naturally as breath, that one day she would know it as he did, not perhaps as a gardener, but as a place that held her. He had not noticed when it began to change, or perhaps he had noticed and called it something else. Growing older, schooling, a young person's restlessness. She no longer waited by the greenhouse. She walked faster through the garden, as though paths were only distances to be crossed. She disliked the damp of the potting shed, the early mornings, the way village people assumed she would remain near Ashcombe because her father had done so. When she spoke of Ludlow, of shops, music lessons, rooms with bright windows, and people who discussed matters beyond weather and soil, Thomas had heard criticism where perhaps there had only been longing. The train moved through a cutting, and the sound deepened around the compartment, becoming enclosed and hollow for several moments. Thomas opened his eyes. The window was black. His reflection had blurred with the vibration of the glass. Marian had left at 21. Not suddenly, not cruelly. There had been letters first, visits to an aunt, conversations with Agnes in the kitchen that stopped when Thomas came in, then the offer of a position in Ludlow, and later marriage, and then the settled fact of a life elsewhere. Thomas had said the proper things. He had stood at the gate on the morning she departed and told her to write. He had placed her trunk on the cart himself. Yet somewhere inside him, beneath all proper conduct, he had felt the old garden close around an absence he did not know how to forgive. Agnes had understood more than he did. "She is not leaving you," she had said one evening, when Marian's first letter from Ludlow lay open on the table. Thomas had been cleaning soil from beneath his nails with a penknife, though there was no need to do it just then. "She has left all the same. She has gone to her own life." He had said nothing, and that is not the same as being unloved, Agnes added. He had remembered the words, though he had not accepted them. Not then, perhaps not for many years after. It had been easier to think of Marian as someone who had turned away from the garden, and therefore from him, than to admit that he had not known how to remain close to a daughter who did not wish to inherit his silence. Now he was going to her. The fact sat quietly across from him, like another passenger. Thomas looked down at the cloth bag again. He had imagined, during the past few days, that he might give Marian the seeds when he arrived. The thought had come to him while packing the rose notebook, and at once he had felt both comforted and ashamed by it. What would she do with them? Her house, as far as he knew, had only a narrow back plot and a little strip of soil near the wall. She might not want an old rose from Ashcombe. She might receive the packet kindly and set it in a drawer. She might plant it badly. She might not plant it at all. And yet he had brought it. The wheel struck a joint in the rail with a slower, measured beat, and Thomas leaned back against the seat. The warmth of the compartment had begun to gather in his coat and waistcoat. His eyelids felt heavy, though his mind would not sleep. Outside, the night continued to pass without revealing itself. Inside, the lamp trembled above him, making a small circle of gold around the faded bag on his knee. He did not open it, not yet. Instead, he sat with one hand resting over it, listening to the newspaper turn in the next compartment, the wind searching softly at the door, the wheels carrying him west through the dark. Somewhere far behind him, Ashcombe Hall stood beneath the same night, its new owners, perhaps not yet asleep, its garden emptied of his footsteps, its rose beds held in darkness. Somewhere ahead, Marian's house waited in Ludlow, with windows he had not yet seen in morning light, and a daughter whose face had grown older in his absence. Between the two, Thomas Elwood sat very still. The train kept its rhythm, the glass clouded with breath, and the little bag of seeds lay closed upon his knee, holding inside it a garden, a marriage, a child's footsteps on gravel, and the first uncertain shape of whatever might still begin. The train slowed some time after midnight, so gradually that Thomas did not notice it at first. The rhythm beneath the floor, which had been steady enough to feel almost like breathing, began to loosen and separate into distinct sounds: wheel, rail, wheel, rail, each one softer than the last. The carriage gave a long sigh through its joints. Somewhere ahead, the engine released steam into the darkness, and the warm compartment filled for a moment with that faint change in pressure which comes when a moving room remembers it is also a machine. Thomas opened his eyes. He had not slept, though he had drifted near the edge of it. The lamp above him still trembled in its brass fitting. The cloth bag remained on his knee beneath his hand, exactly where he had left it, and the window beside him was blurred with so much breath and cold that the outside world appeared only as darkness crossed by pale streaks. Then, as the train slowed further, a yellow light slid across the glass. Another followed. The blackness outside became a platform. It was a small station, smaller than the one he had left, with a low roof, a wet bench, and a board whose painted name had been softened by mist until the letters were almost unreadable. Rain had passed through not long before. The platform stones shone under the gas lamps, and little pools of water lay along the edge where the light gathered in trembling gold. Beyond the station building, no one seemed to be waiting, except a porter with his collar turned up and a woman standing near the lamp with a small leather bag at her feet. Thomas watched without intending to. At his age, he had learned the habit of looking quietly at things without asking anything of them. The woman was younger than he had first thought, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, dressed in a dark traveling cloak that had taken damp along the hem. She wore no bonnet, crowded with decoration, only a plain hat, pinned neatly above hair, gathered close at the nape of her neck. In one arm she carried a flat portfolio case, the kind used for papers or drawings, and beneath the other she held a notebook bound with a strap. She stood very still while the train breathed beside the platform, but her stillness was not uncertain. It was the stillness of someone accustomed to observing before moving. The carriage door opened farther down the train. A murmur of voices entered the night, then footsteps, then the hollow closing of another door. The porter lifted her leather bag, but she took it from him before he could carry it far, thanked him, and stepped toward Thomas's carriage. He lowered his eyes at once, not from rudeness, but from the old instinct of privacy. A compartment was a temporary room, and one did not stare at a person entering a room. The door handle turned. A breath of cold platform air came in first, sharp with rain, coal smoke, and damp wool. Then the woman appeared in the doorway, her cloak dark against the yellow gaslight behind her. She looked into the compartment, saw Thomas, and paused with the polite hesitation of a traveler who did not wish to disturb another's solitude. "May I sit here?" Her voice was low and clear, carrying just enough warmth to soften the formality. Thomas rose halfway, stiffly, one hand gathering the cloth bag from his knee before it could slip. "Of course, madam." She stepped inside, placing her notebook and portfolio carefully on the seat opposite before drawing her small bag in after her. The door closed, shutting out the wet platform and returning the compartment to its close lamplit warmth. For a moment, they arranged themselves in silence, Thomas settling back into his corner, the woman unfastening the clasp of her cloak, smoothing the damp from one sleeve, placing her leather bag beneath the seat with the quiet efficiency of someone used to traveling alone. The train remained still. Outside, steam moved past the window in slow white folds. The porter's boots sounded along the platform. Somewhere, a door slammed. Then the guard's whistle came faintly through the glass, followed by an answering call from farther up the train. The woman glanced toward the window. "A cold night for the last train." Thomas inclined his head. "It is, and a damp one." Yes, he heard how little he had offered, and wondered if it sounded unkind. He had never been skilled at making speech for its own sake, and the years had not improved him. Agnes used to say that he treated conversation as if each word had to be planted at the correct depth. The thought came to him unexpectedly, and with it, a small ache. The train began to move again. The platform lamps drifted backward, slow at first, then faster, sliding along the misted glass like candles carried away down a corridor. The woman watched them until the station disappeared, then removed her gloves finger by finger and laid them across her notebook. Her hands were fine-boned but not idle. Thomas noticed the faint dark mark of ink near one thumb and a small scratch along the side of her forefinger, recently healed. Not a drawing-room hand, he thought. Not quite. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The wheels found their rhythm again. The lamp steadied. The compartment, which had seemed private before, now felt gently altered by another presence. Not crowded, but aware. Thomas placed the cloth bag beside his satchel, half beneath his folded coat. The movement was small, yet the woman's eyes followed it, not intrusively, but with the quick attention of someone trained to notice labels, paper, string, the names by which things are kept from vanishing. On the edge of the brown packet inside the bag, where the cloth had fallen slightly open, Thomas's old penciled writing showed for a moment. Ashcombe blush. The woman did not speak at once. She looked away, as courtesy required. Then, after a little while, when the silence had become natural enough to hold a question, she said, "Forgive me. Did I see the word Ashcombe?" Thomas's hand moved toward the bag, but he did not close it. "You did. Ashcombe Hall." "Yes." Her face changed slightly, not with excitement, but recognition held in check. "Then I hope I have not been staring. I know the name from garden records." Thomas looked at her properly for the first time. Garden records. She gave a small smile. That sounds grander than it is. Mostly old plans, plant lists, estate notebooks, and survey drawings that have been folded too many times. You study gardens, then? I do, or I try to. She rested one hand on the notebook. My name is Eleanor Wren. I work with Mr. Halcombe's office in Shrewsbury, though I am not an architect of houses. My interest is the land around them. Terraces, walls, old orchards, water lines, planting schemes, the ways people once taught a place to hold memory. Thomas did not answer immediately. The phrase should have sounded too fine to him. Many such phrases did. He had heard gentlemen describe gardens in ways that made them seem less real, as if roses were examples of taste before they were living plants with greenfly, mildew, thorns, and roots needing room. Yet Eleanor Wren had not said the words carelessly. She spoke as if memory were something found in soil as much as in books. I was gardener at Ashcombe, he said at last. Were you? She leaned forward a fraction, then seemed to remember herself, and settled back. I beg your pardon. That sounded too eager. It is no matter. For many years, Thomas looked down at his hands. Most of them. The answer was plain, but it carried more than she could have known. He had not meant it to. He had only spoken the truth in the shortest way available. Eleanor received it quietly. She did not ask, as others might have done, whether he was retired, dismissed, displaced, or moving on. She did not ask whether the hall had been sold, though perhaps she knew. She only said, "Then you must know the south wall." Thomas's eyes returned to her. "Aye," he said softly, "I know it. I saw a plan once," she continued, her voice careful now, as though stepping through a border where seedlings had just appeared. Not the garden itself, only a copy of a copy, probably inaccurate. It marked a rose walk along the inner wall and a glass house near the north corner. The glass house is west of the dipping tank, Thomas said before he could stop himself. Eleanor's smile deepened, not triumphantly, but with pleasure at being corrected by someone who knew. Then the copy was inaccurate. Most copies are. Yes, she said, especially when made by people who have never had to carry water across the path. That, unexpectedly, almost made him smile. The train rocked gently through the dark. Outside, the countryside was invisible again, except for the occasional glimmer of water beside the track. Inside, Eleanor opened her notebook only enough to slip a loose paper farther in, then closed it without writing. Thomas noticed and was grateful. He did not wish to become an entry. "You are travelling to Ludlow?" she asked, after another stretch of companionable quiet. "Yes, so am I. For a little way beyond it, there is a garden near Leominster I have been asked to look at, or what remains of one." "What remains?" Thomas repeated. "So often it is that." She looked toward the window, where their reflections sat facing one another against the dark. A wall, a pond shape, old fruit trees, sometimes only a name on a map, but even that can tell something, if one is patient. Thomas thought of Ashcombe behind him, and of the men with rolled plans. He thought of the south wall, marked as something to clear, simplify, open, improve. He wondered whether, years from now, someone like Eleanor Wren might find a reference to Ashcombe Blush in a notebook and wonder where it had grown. "The young are very patient with old things now," he said, though he had not intended to sound quite so dry. Eleanor did not take offense. "Some of us are," Some of us are impatient in a scholarly way, which may be worse. This time, the smile reached him faintly. A softer silence followed. It was not the closed silence Thomas had brought with him from Ashcombe, but a quieter one, warmed slightly by the fact that no one had forced it open. Eleanor removed a pencil from her bag, looked at its blunt end, then put it away again. Thomas adjusted the fold of his coat over the cloth bag, though no longer to hide it completely. The label could still be seen if one looked. Ashcombe Blush. Eleanor's eyes rested on it once more. Is that a rose? Thomas nodded. An old variety. Old to Ashcombe. That may be the truer measure. He looked at her, unsure whether she understood what she had said. She continued gently. Some roses belong less to catalogues than to places. A wall, a gardener, a certain kind of mourning. Move them elsewhere, and they may live, but part of the name remains behind. Thomas's fingers tightened once over the edge of his coat. "Aye," he said, "that may be so." Eleanor seemed to hear the limit in his voice and did not press further. Instead, she asked about the route, whether the line would be slow over the wet ground, whether the Shropshire hills would be visible by morning if the mist lifted. Thomas answered what he knew. She spoke of travelling at night for the sake of early appointments, of how railway lamps made every small station look briefly important, of how the countryside after midnight seemed larger than by day because one could not see its edges. Their conversation remained slight, almost ordinary, and because of that, it did not trouble him. Yet something had shifted. Thomas had entered the compartment as a man carrying the last seeds of a garden no one had asked him to preserve. Now, across from him, sat a young woman who knew that a south wall could matter, that a copied plan could lie, that the placing of a glass house was not a detail, but a memory of labour, weather, and use. She had not known Agnes. She had not seen Marion running along the gravel. She had not stood in June beneath Ashcombe Blush. Still, she had looked at the old label and understood that it belonged to something more than a packet. The train moved on. After a while, Eleanor drew her cloak closer around her shoulders and leaned back against the seat. Thomas returned his gaze to the window. Their reflections hovered faintly in the dark glass. The old gardener, with his folded coat and guarded hands, the young landscape architect with her notebook and rain-dark hem, both travelling west through a night that seemed to hold more country than it showed. No confession had been made, no sorrow had been named, but the compartment was no longer quite empty around Thomas, and the little cloth bag beside him no longer felt entirely unseen. It was Eleanor who first mentioned tea, though she did so almost apologetically, as if the word itself might be too ordinary for the hour. The train had been running for some time through a stretch of country where no station lights appeared, and the compartment had grown close with warmth, wool, and the steady breathing of the lamp. Thomas had settled back into his corner, one hand resting near the cloth bag, while Eleanor had opened her notebook only to close it again, as though she too had discovered that certain things were better left unwritten while they were still alive in the air between people. From farther along the train came the faint movement of a door, followed by the soft clink of china. It was not loud, hardly more than a small bright sound carried through the corridor, but in the depth of the night it reached them clearly. Eleanor lifted her head. "I believe they are still serving tea," she said. Thomas looked toward the door. "At this hour? On the last train, yes. Not grandly, I expect, but warmly." He might have declined, In another mood, or perhaps in the mood he had carried with him from Ashcombe, he would have said that he needed nothing and remained where he was until Ludlow. But the compartment, for all its warmth, had become too full of what had not been said. The little bag lay beside him like a quiet question. Eleanor Wren had not asked him to answer it, yet her presence had made him aware that silence, when held too long, could become a locked gate. "A cup of tea would not hurt," he said. Eleanor smiled, not as if she had persuaded him, but as if the evening had offered them a small mercy and they had both accepted it. She gathered her gloves, though she did not put them on, and took up her notebook out of habit before setting it down again. Thomas reached for his satchel, then thought better of it. The cloth bag, however, he placed inside his coat pocket with slow care. It had travelled against him too long to be left behind, even in a locked compartment on a moving train. The corridor outside was narrow and dimly lit. Brass handrails ran along one side, cool to the touch, where the warmth of the compartments did not reach. The carriage swayed beneath their feet, and Thomas moved more slowly than Eleanor, though she did not hurry ahead. Closed doors passed them one by one, each with its own small square of curtained glass. Behind one came the low murmur of two men speaking drowsily. Behind another, someone slept with a soft, open-mouthed rhythm that rose and fell with the motion of the train. The lamps along the corridor burned at intervals, leaving brief lengths of shadow between their yellow pools of light. At the joining of the carriages, the night pressed close. For a moment, as Thomas stepped across the shifting metal plates, he heard the wheels more sharply beneath him, iron striking iron, with a hollow, repeating force. Cold air came up through some unseen gap and touched his ankles. Eleanor held the rail and waited until he had crossed. She said nothing about his age, and for that, too, he was grateful. The dining car was small, narrower than he had imagined, with a row of tables fastened near the windows and a central passage just wide enough for a steward to pass with a tray. The white cloths were clean but slightly creased, lifting at the corners whenever the train leaned. Small shaded lamps burned above the tables, their flames trembling behind glass, and the silver spoons laid beside the cups gave tiny flashes each time the carriage moved. There were few passengers there. An elderly couple sat near the far end, speaking so quietly that their words dissolved into the general sound of the train. A young clerk with ink-stained cuffs bent over a letter he seemed too tired to finish. Near the service door, a steward arranged plates of bread and butter with the grave attention of a man performing a familiar duty at an unreasonable hour. Eleanor chose a table beside the window. Thomas sat opposite her, slowly, placing his hat on the seat beside him. The glass beyond them was black, not like a window at all, but like polished stone. It reflected the two of them in faint yellow tones. Eleanor, with her dark cloak folded back from her shoulders, Thomas, with his lined face, turned partly toward the table, his hands resting near the edge of the cloth, as if still uncertain where they belonged. The steward came with tea in a white pot, 2 cups, a little jug of milk, and a plate of bread already spread with butter. The china was thick and plain. When he set it down, the cups gave a small sound against their saucers, quick and delicate, and the spoon near Thomas's hand shifted with a silver whisper. Steam rose from the pot in a pale thread, and at once the smell of hot tea entered the narrow space, mild, tannic, and comforting in a way that did not require memory, though memory came with it all the same. Agnes had made tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, especially on mornings when frost had silvered the cabbage leaves and Thomas came in from the garden with his fingers numb. Marion, as a girl, had taken more milk than tea and left a pale circle at the bottom of the cup. Later, when she was older and already thinking beyond Ashcombe, she had drunk it quickly before leaving for town, as if even breakfast were something she must pass through on her way elsewhere. Eleanor poured for him first. "Milk?" she asked. "A little." She added it carefully, watching the color soften from brown to warm amber, then passed the cup across. Thomas wrapped both hands around it, feeling the heat come through the china into his stiff fingers. For a while they drank in silence. The train rocked gently. The spoons chimed against the saucers. Outside, the night showed nothing but their reflections. Two travelers seated opposite one another in a small lamplit room that happened to be moving through miles of unseen country. At length, Eleanor set down her cup. "I hope you will forgive me if I return to the rose," she said. Thomas looked at her over the rim of his cup. "I do not mean to pry," she continued. "Only, I have learned that when a plant carries a place name, someone usually cared enough to remember it, and when someone carries the seed by train, it is seldom an ordinary packet." Thomas did not answer at once. He turned the cup slightly in its saucer, watching the tea move in a slow, dark circle. Her words were direct, but not careless. That made them harder to refuse. A careless question could be shut out. A respectful one opened a door by standing quietly beside it. "It grew on the south wall," he said finally, "near the older pear trees." Eleanor folded her hands around her cup and listened. "It was never much written down," Thomas continued. "Not properly. I have seen no catalogue call it by that name. There may have been another name for it once, before my time, but at Ashcombe, it was Ashcombe blush. The old head gardener called it so, and his master before him, I suppose. By the time I came there, everyone knew what was meant." "What was it like?" Thomas looked toward the black window, where his own reflection seemed to wait for the answer. "Pale," he said. "Not white. Not pink enough to be called pink by anyone fond of certainty. There was a warmth in the center of it, very slight, like apricot held under thin paper. The petals opened loosely. In wet weather, they spoiled if you did not watch them, and in dry wind, they went over too quickly. But on a still morning in June, when the brick had taken the sun and the bees had found the wall, it had a scent that seemed to come and go before you were sure of it." Eleanor's expression did not change much, but Thomas saw that she had received the description as one receives something fragile. "And it is gone now?" she asked. "The old plant failed after the hard winter 2 years ago. I tried cuttings. None took. One root looked hopeful for a time, then blackened. I am sorry." He gave a small movement of the head. "Roses die, yes," she said, "but not every death is only botanical." The sentence was quiet enough that he could have pretended not to hear it. Instead, he sat with it. The train moved through a curve, and the lamps leaned slightly, sending a tremor of light across the tablecloth. The tea in his cup shivered. "I saved hips from the last flowering," he said. "Not many. Seeds are uncertain. They may come to nothing. They may not resemble the old plant. Even if they grow, They may be poor things, but still alive, perhaps. That is a large perhaps. Thomas looked down at his hands. The knuckles were broad, weathered, and a little swollen, the nails clean, but marked permanently by years of soil and work. I used to know what to do with such things, he said. A seed tray, grit in the compost, patience, a cold frame if needed, watch for damping off, prick out only when there is enough strength in the stem. I know the method. He stopped. Eleanor waited. It is the place I no longer have, he said. The words came out more plainly than he had expected. Once spoken, they seemed to lie between them, with the simplicity of a tool placed on a bench. Not dramatic, not eloquent, only true. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the tea. A garden can make a person believe the place and the life are the same thing, she said, especially when the life has been faithful to it. Thomas's mouth tightened slightly. They are not easily separated. No, the new owners do not hate it, he said, and heard the tiredness in his own voice. That might be easier. They are not cruel people. They have plans, improvements, open views, less maintenance, better use of the land, they say. Perhaps they are right in their way. Perhaps in their way, but they do not know how to read it. His eyes returned to Eleanor. They see a wall where mornings happened. They see old roses where names were kept. They see a glass house that costs money to repair. They do not see why the path bends, or why the dipping tank stands where it does, or why certain beds were never moved, though every fashion changed around them. Eleanor's face softened. Many gardens disappear like that, she said, not because anyone despises them, because no one has been taught what they are looking at. Thomas absorbed this without speaking. It is like an old handwriting, she continued. To one person, only faded marks. To another, a record of a hand, a pressure, a habit, an affection. A garden is not so different. Lines, repetitions, corrections, places where something failed and someone tried again. The steward passed behind them with a tray, and for a moment the table filled with the scent of fresh toast from another passenger's plate. The small, ordinary smell loosened something in the air. Thomas took a piece of bread and butter, though he had not felt hungry. It was soft at the center, the butter cool and faintly salted. He ate slowly, more because Eleanor had made the night feel possible than because the body had asked. You speak as though you know gardens from books, he said after a while. But not only books. My father was a surveyor, Eleanor replied. When I was a child, he took me to estates where he had business. I was meant to sit quietly in traps and kitchens, and often I did. But if there was a wall, or a pond, or an old orchard, I would wander until someone had to find me. Later, when I was old enough to be told what I could not become, I became as much of it as I was allowed. A landscape architect, a modest one, young enough that many clients first assume I am carrying papers for someone else. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a wry acceptance that did not ask him to comment. Thomas nodded. He understood something of being mistaken for less than one's knowledge, though in his case, it had come not from youth or womanhood, but from the plainness of labor. Men with softer hands had asked him whether a tree might be moved, as though it were furniture. Do you restore them, he asked. The gardens. When I can. Sometimes only parts. Sometimes only records. Sometimes I arrive too late. and can do nothing but draw what remains before it is altered beyond knowing. That must be poor comfort. It is, but poor comfort is not the same as none. Thomas held his cup a little closer. The heat had lessened, but the china was still warm. I kept notebooks, he said. Rose dates, weather, pruning, failures, bloom counts, things no one else would read. Those are exactly the things someone should read. He glanced at her sharply, suspecting kindness. She met the look without flinching. I mean it. Estate accounts tell us what was purchased. Plans tell us what someone intended. But a gardener's notes tell us what actually lived. For the first time that night, Thomas felt the full weight of the rose notebook in his satchel. He had packed it because he could not leave it behind, but he had thought of it as a private remnant, useful only to the man who had made it, and even to him only, until memory failed. Eleanor spoke of it as if it belonged, in some small way, to the world beyond his grief. He did not know whether he was comforted by that. Comfort, when it came too near, could feel like trespass, yet he did not reject it. The train passed over a bridge. The sound beneath them changed at once, becoming larger, hollow, and resonant, as though the night below had opened into water. The cups trembled in their saucers. Eleanor placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the plate to keep it from sliding. Thomas listened to the brief thunder under the carriage, then to its fading as the wheels returned to solid ground. "River," he said. "I wondered. Too dark to see it. Sometimes one only hears the crossing." He looked at her again, and she gave no sign that she had meant anything beyond the bridge. Perhaps she had not. Still, the words settled. They drank the last of the tea. The elderly couple at the far end rose and moved carefully toward the corridor. The clerk folded his unfinished letter, slipped it into a pocket, and closed his eyes with his chin resting on his chest. The steward began clearing one of the empty tables. Around them, the dining car grew quieter, the hour deepening until even small sounds seemed to have softened out of respect for sleep. Eleanor reached for the teapot and found it nearly empty. "Another cup?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, thank you." But he did not rise immediately. Instead, he sat looking at the black window where the dining car reflected itself. The lamps, the white cloths, the dull shine of spoons, Eleanor's thoughtful face, his own hand lying near the saucer, old and still. Beyond that reflection there were fields, hills, streams, villages, church towers, and bare trees passing unseen. The world was there whether or not the glass revealed it. After a long silence, he said, "My daughter may not care for roses." Eleanor did not answer too quickly. "She may not. She left Ashcombe years ago. Many people leave places they love." Thomas looked down. "And many leave places they cannot love, in the way expected of them," Eleanor added, more gently. He said nothing, but the words entered him, not sharply, not as argument, more like water finding dry soil. "I thought," he said slowly, "that if she did not care for the garden, she did not care for what I had given my life to. That is a lonely thought." Was it true? The question was simple, and because it was simple, he could not answer it. He saw Marion at 6, carrying a basket of feathers and broken labels. Marion at 13, walking too fast along the path. Marion at 21, leaving with her trunk on the cart. Marion's letters, kind at first, then fewer. His own replies, proper and brief, Agnes's voice saying, "She has gone to her own life, and that is not the same as being unloved." "I do not know," he said. Eleanor nodded, as if that were enough for the moment. Then perhaps Ludlow need not answer everything in one morning. No, perhaps it only has to receive you. Thomas looked toward the window again. His reflection seemed older than before, but not quite as solitary. He thought of the cloth bag in his pocket, the seeds inside their brown paper, the rose that might never resemble the one he remembered, the daughter who might not wish to inherit it, the house in Ludlow with its unknown rooms and narrow plot of soil. He had carried Ashcombe as if it were a thing to be saved whole or lost whole. But a seed did not save a garden whole. It did something smaller, stranger, and more uncertain. It began again without promising to be the same. At last Eleanor rose, gathering her gloves and notebook. Thomas stood more slowly, one hand on the table, until the carriage steadied. The steward nodded as they passed. The corridor beyond the dining car was dimmer than before, and colder. Closed compartments lined the passage. The train ran on through the deep middle of the night. Neither of them spoke on the way back. There was no need yet. The tea had warmed his hands. The old rose had been named aloud, and somewhere between Ashcombe and Ludlow, in a narrow dining car with trembling lamps and black windows, Thomas Elwood had begun, very quietly, to understand that what was lost might still be carried without being kept unchanged. When they returned from the dining car, the train seemed quieter than before, though it had not truly slowed. It still ran steadily through the dark, iron wheels striking their long measure beneath the floor, the carriages swaying with that soft, persistent motion which made every lamp tremble and every shadow breathe. Yet the hour had changed. The earlier part of the night had still belonged faintly to departure, to stations, voices, luggage, and the last duties of travel. Now it belonged to silence. Most of the compartment doors were closed. Behind the curtained glass, passengers had folded themselves into sleep as best they could, hats lowered over faces, coats drawn to the chin, gloved hands resting loosely in laps. A little yellow light seeped from beneath each door and lay in narrow lines along the floorboards. The corridor itself was dim, its brass rail catching the lamplight in occasional dull gleams. At the far end, where one carriage joined the next, a darker square of glass showed nothing but the night pressing close. Thomas walked slowly, one hand near the rail, but not always touching it. Eleanor moved beside him, with her notebook held against her chest. Neither of them spoke. After the warmth of the dining car, the corridor air felt thinner, sharpened by small draughts that entered around door frames and beneath the carriage joins. It smelled faintly of coal smoke, varnished wood, damp wool, and old leather. Every few steps, the floor shifted underfoot, and Thomas felt the familiar caution of age rise through his knees. They reached the door of their compartment, but Thomas did not open it at once. He stood with his hand near the handle, looking beyond it, toward the long window at the end of the corridor. The glass there was taller than the compartment window and less clouded by breath. It showed a narrow view of the outside world, if darkness could be called a view. Now and then, a pale shape passed quickly across it. The bare arm of a tree, the low blur of a hedge, the sudden white mark of a milestone caught in the train's light and gone before the eye could properly receive it. Eleanor noticed his pause. "Would you like a moment?" she asked. Thomas looked at the compartment door, then back toward the window. I may stand a little, of course. She did not go in without him. Instead, she stepped aside and stood near the opposite wall, leaving him the window without making him feel watched. It was a small kindness, and because it was small, it reached him. Thomas moved to the end of the corridor. The brass rail beneath his hand was cold. He curled his fingers around it and looked out. The countryside lay almost entirely hidden, yet it was not empty. It moved past in layers of black, near hedge, farther field, rising ground, clumps of trees, and once, for a brief second, the square orange glow of a farmhouse window set far back from the line. The light appeared, held, and vanished. Then another came, smaller and lower, perhaps a cottage or a lamp in an outbuilding where someone had risen early or not yet gone to bed. The train entered a cutting. At once, the sound changed. The wheels, which had been broad and open beneath them, grew enclosed. The dark banks on either side threw the noise back against the carriage, and the floor seemed to deepen under Thomas's feet. For several moments, the whole train was held inside a hollow roar. Then they emerged, and the sound loosened again, spreading out into the unseen fields. Thomas kept his hand on the rail. I knew every sound at Ashcombe, he said. His voice was low enough that Eleanor might have pretended not to hear. She did not. The gate to the kitchen garden had a scrape in it, he continued. Only in damp weather. In summer it swung clear. The glasshouse roof ticked after frost when the sun touched it. The pump near the dipping tank gave 2 hard knocks before the water came. One of the old pear trees creaked in an east wind, though it was sound enough if properly watched. He looked down at his hand on the brass rail. Here, I know nothing. Eleanor remained quiet. Thomas breathed in slowly. That is the strangest part, not the leaving itself. A man knows he will leave all things in the end, but to be set down where nothing answers back in the old way. Outside, the dark opened briefly. The train crossed high ground, or perhaps a low bridge over a road, and Thomas saw, far below or far away, 3 lamps moving together. A cart, perhaps. Then they were gone. I do not know who I am, he said. If I am not the gardener at Ashcombe. The words came more heavily than he had expected. He had not prepared them. He had not meant to confess anything. Yet the corridor, with its closed doors and dim lamps, seemed made for truths that could not quite be spoken while seated, face to face. One could say them into the dark and allow another person to hear them from the side. Eleanor stepped a little nearer, though not too near. You are Thomas Elwood, she said. He gave the faintest movement that might have been a smile and might only have been weariness. That is a name. Yes, a name is not work. No, Eleanor said. But work is not all of a person, even when it has held most of his days. Thomas looked out again. It held the best of mine. Did it? He did not answer quickly. He thought of the garden in June, and of the satisfaction of a bed newly edged, a wall fruit properly trained, a tray of seedlings standing upright after a difficult start. He thought of Agnes carrying tea to the potting shed door and laughing because he had soil on his forehead. He thought of Marion, at 6 years old, asking whether roses knew when they were admired. He thought of winter evenings when his back ached and he fell asleep in his chair before the fire. He thought of the long years after Agnes died, when work had been not only work, but the structure that kept grief from filling every room. "The garden held what I could not," he said at last. "Eleanor received that with care. Then it did more than employ you." The train ran on. For a while, neither spoke. The corridor lamps trembled in their fittings. Somewhere behind them, a passenger coughed in sleep. A door latch clicked softly as the carriage swayed, then settled. Thomas could feel the packet of seeds inside his coat pocket, small and flat against his ribs. It seemed impossible that something so slight could have become so heavy. "My daughter is waiting at Ludlow," he said. "Marian." He glanced at Eleanor, surprised. "You mentioned her name in the dining car," she said gently. "So I did." He had not realized. Names sometimes escaped before the heart had granted permission. "She wrote," he continued, "after the sale was settled, said I must come to her. She has a house there, a husband, children, though they are near grown now. I have seen them, but not often. That is kind of her." Yes, but the word did not sit easily. Eleanor heard it, and difficult. Thomas's fingers tightened on the rail. "Kindness may be difficult." "Yes," she said, "it can be." He looked through the glass, where his reflection hovered over the dark fields. "I do not know her house. I do not know her mornings. I do not know where she keeps the tea, or whether the back door sticks, or what light comes through the kitchen window. I do not know whether there is room for me, except in the way duty makes room. Did she write from duty? I cannot tell. Did she ask you, or merely allow you?" The distinction struck him. Thomas searched his memory of the letter. Marian's hand firmer than Agnes's had been, the paper clean, the wording practical, because she had always become practical when tenderness might have exposed too much. "Father, you must come to us when Ashcombe is settled. There is no question of your lodging elsewhere. James agrees entirely. The small back room gets the morning sun and will suit you, I think. Write with your train time, and I shall meet you if I can. Or send Edward." He had read it as duty, because duty was easier to receive than love. "She said there was no question of my lodging elsewhere," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly, but did not soften the moment with it. "That sounds rather more than allowance." Thomas said nothing. The train passed through another patch of open country. A few low lights appeared far apart, scattered like embers under the dark line of hills. Thomas watched them without seeing them clearly. Somewhere beyond the night was Ludlow. Somewhere in Ludlow was Marian, older now, no longer the girl with the basket of feathers and broken labels, no longer the young woman turning away from Ashcombe's gate with her trunk on the cart. He had kept those versions of her too firmly, perhaps because they required nothing new from him. A child could be remembered, a departing daughter could be grieved over, but a grown woman had to be met. "I thought," he said slowly, "that when she left the garden, she left me." Eleanor did not interrupt. "She never said so," she wrote. "Not often enough, I thought. Then I answered less warmly than I might have done. Then her letters became careful. Mine became shorter. Agnes told me I was making a wall and calling it sorrow." His mouth moved slightly at the memory. "She was often right?" Eleanor asked. "Almost always." The answer came so simply that for a moment Agnes felt nearer than Ashcombe. Thomas could see her at the kitchen table, one hand around a cup, her hair still dark then, her expression patient but not indulgent. She had loved him without allowing him the comfort of being entirely wronged. She said Marion had gone to her own life, Thomas continued. Not from love, only toward life. Eleanor looked out into the dark. That sounds like something worth remembering. I remembered it. I did not accept it. Those are different labors. The train began to climb slightly. Thomas could feel it more than see it. A subtle change in the pull beneath the wheels. The engine working with a deeper breath. The corridor leaned and steadied. He adjusted his feet and kept his hand on the rail. What if she has no garden? He asked. Then perhaps she has a window. What if she does not want the seeds? Then the seeds will still be what they are. That is not an answer. No, Eleanor said. It is only a gentler question. He turned to her. She spoke carefully. Must Marion love Ashcombe blush for your life at Ashcombe to have mattered? The question stood between them, quiet and exact. Thomas looked away first. Outside, the train crossed a bridge. The sound rose suddenly beneath the floor, hollow and ringing, larger than the carriage itself. For several seconds the whole train seemed suspended above darkness, iron over unseen water, lamps shivering in their glass shades, the brass rail cold under his hand. Thomas listened until the bridge passed behind them, and the wheels returned to their ordinary rhythm. No, he said. It was hardly louder than the wheels. Then, after a long pause, but I wanted her to. Eleanor's expression softened. Of course you did. There was mercy in that. Not correction, not explanation. Only the simple allowance that a wish could be human, even when it could no longer govern the world. Thomas let his shoulders lower. I wanted her to know what I knew, he said. The right morning to lift a root, the smell of the first warm rain on brick. How a rose looks dead before it proves otherwise. How to wait. Perhaps she learned other forms of waiting. He considered this. Perhaps. Again the word did not heal anything quickly, but it made room around what had been fixed. At the far end of the corridor, the train lamps cast a trembling oval on the wood floor. Eleanor looked toward their compartment door, then back at Thomas. She seemed about to suggest they return, but waited. He was grateful for that too. The night had not finished with him. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the cloth bag, feeling the stitched edge Agnes had made with small, even work. For years, her sewing had mended what his hands tore. Cuffs, seed bags, apron ties, the lining of a coat pocket, Marion's childhood pinafore caught on a thorn. He had once thought such work smaller than his own, because it was done indoors and left no beds blooming in June. Age had corrected him. Some things held because someone had quietly stitched them. I do not know how to live in her house, he said. Then you may learn one room at a time. He breathed out, almost a laugh, but not quite. You make it sound like planting. Most things are, if one is humbled enough. Thomas looked at her then, and the faint smile did come. It changed his face only slightly, but it was there. Miss Wren, he said, you are young to speak so often of humility. My profession supplies regular instruction. This time, the smile remained a moment longer. The train ran on, softer now, as though the tracks had entered a more level part of the country. The dark beyond the glass no longer seemed quite as blank. It was still unknowable, but not empty. It held fields, rivers, sleeping villages, and the approach of morning somewhere beyond sight. Thomas stood with his hand on the cold brass rail and felt, not comfort exactly, but a loosening, as if some knot within him had been left in warm water. He had thought he was traveling from a lost garden to a daughter who might not understand it. Perhaps he was also traveling toward a daughter he had not understood. That thought did not accuse him. It simply stood near him in the corridor after midnight, patient as Eleanor, patient as the unseen fields, patient as seeds waiting through winter in the dark. At last Thomas turned from the window. "I think I will sit down now," he said. Eleanor nodded. Yes. They walked back the few steps to the compartment. Thomas opened the door quietly, careful not to let it strike the frame. The small room inside was just as they had left it. The dark seats, the brass rack, the lamp burning low, the cold window clouded with breath. Yet it seemed changed, because he had changed slightly while standing outside it. Eleanor returned to her place opposite. Thomas sat down more slowly, drawing the cloth bag from his pocket and laying it once again upon his knee. He did not open it yet, but his hand rested over it differently now, not as if guarding the last proof of a vanished place, but as if feeling for the first small sign of life inside something dry and quiet. The train kept moving west. The corridor lamps burned behind the door, and Thomas Elwood sat in the warm compartment, carrying Ashcombe, carrying Agnes, carrying Marion, and only beginning, to understand that love might leave a garden and still be love. Back in the compartment, the silence had become deeper, but it was no longer hard. It lay around them with the quiet weight of the late hour, softened by the low lamp, the clouded glass, and the steady westward motion of the train. The corridor beyond the door had fallen still again. Whatever had been said there seemed to remain outside it, not lost, but placed carefully behind them, as one might leave a damp coat on a hook before coming nearer to the fire. Thomas sat with the cloth bag on his knee. For a while he did not open it. Eleanor had returned to the opposite seat and drawn her cloak around her shoulders, but she did not close her eyes. Her notebook rested beside her, untouched. The pencil lay across it, blunt and unnecessary. She looked not at Thomas's face, but at his hands, or perhaps only at the old bag beneath them, with the patience of someone who understood that certain things could not be hurried without being harmed. The train rocked gently. Outside the window, there was nothing to see but blackness and the faint reflection of the lamp. At times the glass cleared for a moment, where the cold pressed more firmly against it, and a streak of hedge or a pale post flew by, only to vanish again. The compartment seemed very small in that moving darkness, small enough for the sound of cloth being touched to matter. At last, Thomas loosened the string. It was Agnes's string, or so he still thought of it, though any shop might have sold the same kind. She had saved such things in a drawer by the kitchen range, lengths of twine, folded paper, scraps of linen, seed envelopes, old labels that could be turned and written on again. Nothing useful had been thrown away quickly in Agnes's keeping. She had possessed a faith in small remnants that Thomas, who worked with roots and seasons, should have understood better than he had. The knot resisted him. His fingers, stiff from age and cold, worked at it slowly. Eleanor did not offer to help. That, too, was kindness. After a little while, the string loosened, and the mouth of the bag opened beneath his hands. Inside were several paper packets, all folded flat and tied together with a narrower thread. Some bore labels written in ink by Thomas himself. Others were older. The writing faded, the paper browned at the creases. He touched them one by one, without taking them out at first. Sweet pea, east border, wallflower, saved after frost, marigold, Agnes's strain, then the brown packet, Ashcombe blush. The label was written in pencil because, when he had made it, his ink bottle had dried at the neck and he had not wanted to wait. He remembered that clearly now, the late afternoon light on the potting bench, the smell of dry leaves, the rose hips split carefully with his knife, the seeds washed and laid to dry on a bit of old muslin. He had written the name quickly, almost roughly, because he had still believed there would be time to make a cleaner label later. There had not been. He lifted the packet out. It was lighter than it should have been. That was the strange thing about seeds, how little they weighed against what one asked of them. A man could carry a tree in his pocket, a border in a folded paper, a whole summer reduced to something that scarcely pressed upon the palm. Thomas unfolded the top edge. A few dry seeds rolled into his hand. They were small, dull, uneven things, neither beautiful nor promising to anyone who did not know what they were. They looked almost like fragments of grit shaken from a gardener's cuff. Not a rose, not even the idea of a rose, unless one had learned to trust what could not yet show itself. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Thomas held out his palm, not to give them to her, but to let her see. "There," he said. His voice was rougher than before. "That is all." Eleanor looked at the seeds for a long moment. The lamp trembled above them, and the little dry shapes cast shadows so faint they were nearly invisible. "No," she said softly, "not all." Thomas did not move. "A keepsake?" he asked, though he already knew she would not choose that word. Eleanor shook her head. "A keepsake remembers what has ended. And these have not decided yet." The answer was so simple that Thomas almost turned away from it. But the seeds lay in his palm, and there was nowhere for the truth of them to hide. They were not the rose he had lost. They were not the south wall. They were not June sunlight on brick, nor Agnes standing in the path with her apron full of cut flowers, nor Marion, as a child, asking whether bees preferred pale roses to red ones. They were not Ashcombe as it had been, but they were not nothing. He looked down at them, and for the first time since leaving the hall, he understood the difference. "I kept thinking," he said, "that I was carrying the end of it." Eleanor's voice remained low. "Perhaps you are carrying what was ready to travel." Thomas closed his fingers very carefully, not enough to crush the seeds, only enough to feel them against his skin. The compartment seemed to warm around him, or perhaps the warmth had been there all along, and he had only just become able to notice it. "They may never flower," he said. "They may not. They may flower poorly. They may. They may come up, unlike the old rose." "Yes." He looked at her then. "You are not very comforting, Miss Wren." A faint smile touched her mouth. "I am trying to be truthful enough to be useful." That, unexpectedly, pleased him. He looked back at his palm. Truthful enough to be useful. It was something Agnes might have said of a tool, or a neighbour, or a sermon she had approved of despite its length. Thomas could almost hear her voice in it. Not everything gentle was soft. Some gentleness had strength, because it did not lie. He opened his hand again. The seeds rested in the hollow of his palm. For years, he had judged life by its visible signs. a bud swelling cleanly, a graft taking, a seedling lifting its first bent neck from compost. Even in winter, he had trusted roots because he knew where he had planted them. But these seeds required a different trust. They asked him to believe in what might begin, away from the wall that had made their name, away from the hands that had first trained the canes, away from the garden whose paths had taught him the measure of his days. He thought of Marian, not the child, not the leaving girl, but Marian now, a woman in Ludlow, with her own rooms, her own cupboards, her own worries folded into mornings he had never seen. He had imagined arriving with the seeds as if bringing a test. Would she understand? Would she care? Would she receive Ashcombe properly? Now the thought shamed him a little, but gently. A gift was not meant to examine the heart of the person receiving it. He could offer the seeds, that was all. If Marian wanted them, they might find a pot, a strip of soil, a place by a wall if there was one. If she did not, he could keep them a little longer, or give them to someone who would try, or write their name into his notebook, with enough care that, even if no flower came, Ashcombe blush would not pass entirely unspoken. None of these was the ending he had wanted, yet not one of them was loveless. Agnes would have known what to do, he said. Eleanor did not ask who Agnes was. By now, perhaps she knew enough. What would she have done? Thomas's eyes remained on the seeds. She would have asked Marian whether she had a sunny wall before I had finished taking off my coat. Eleanor smiled. And if Marian had said no, she would have asked about a pot. And if there were no pot, then she would have found one. The small memory opened in him like a cupboard door, letting out the scent of ordinary days. Agnes rinsing jars, saving string, turning collars, making use out of almost nothing. Agnes standing between him and Marian, when both had become too proud to speak plainly. Agnes, who had never mistaken stubbornness for devotion. She had more faith than I did, Thomas said. In roses? In people? Eleanor accepted this in silence. The train gave a long, low whistle, distant and mournful, though nothing in it was truly sad. It was only the sound of movement through darkness, warning the sleeping countryside that iron and steam were passing by. Thomas listened until it faded. Then he returned the seeds to the packet, one by one, using the care of a man handling something both fragile and practical. Before folding the paper, he paused. "Would you write something for me?" he asked. Eleanor looked up. Of course. He handed her the packet. She took it carefully, as though accepting a document of some importance. From her notebook, she drew the pencil and waited. Thomas considered. The old label said only Ashcombe Blush. It had been enough when the garden existed around it, when the wall, the beds, the glass house, and the gardener's own memory supplied the rest. But away from Ashcombe, the name seemed too bare. A seed needed more than a name. It needed instruction, not too much, just enough to begin. "Right," he said slowly. "Saved from the south wall, Ashcombe Hall. Last flowering before removal." Eleanor wrote, in small, clear letters, beneath his pencil mark. Thomas watched. Then he added, "Try in warmth. Do not expect the same bloom." Eleanor paused at that, then wrote it too. "Do not expect the same bloom." When she handed the packet back, Thomas read the words twice. They seemed meant for the rose. They were also meant for him. Perhaps Eleanor knew it. Perhaps she did not. He was grateful either way. He folded the packet and placed it back inside the cloth bag. But he did not tie the string at once. Instead, he let the bag remain open on his knee, the other packets visible in the lamplight: marigold, wallflower, sweet pea, the saved fragments of seasons that had not yet surrendered themselves entirely to memory. "I may show Marion," he said. "Yes, I may ask, without making it heavy. That would be kind." He breathed out slowly. "And if she says no, then you will still have asked kindly." Thomas nodded. The answer did not promise him happiness. It did not restore the south wall or call back the old rose. It did not make him less afraid of Ludlow, or of the small back room with morning sun, or of sitting at his daughter's table as a guest in the life she had made without him. But it gave him a way to arrive. That was something. The train moved on through the last deep portion of night. Eleanor leaned back at last, her face turned slightly toward the window, her eyes open but resting. Thomas remained awake, though his body had grown tired enough that the edges of the compartment seemed softened. He placed one hand over the open cloth bag, not guarding it now, simply keeping it steady as the carriage swayed. The seeds were no longer proof of an ending. They were not yet a beginning either. They were a question, small and dry and patient, carried in brown paper toward morning. Thomas closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them stood Ashcombe, the south wall, the old pear trees, the dipping tank, the glass house after rain. Before them waited Ludlow, unknown rooms, a daughter's face changed by years, perhaps a strip of soil, perhaps no soil at all. Between the two, in the warm compartment of the last train, Thomas held the little bag against his knee and let the future remain uncertain. Not empty, only uncertain. The Last Train to Ludlow, Part 7. Ludlow at Dawn. By the time the last dark of night began to loosen from the window glass, Thomas Elwood was not sure whether he had slept. He had sat for some time with his hand resting over the small cloth bag, feeling the slow motion of the train through his knees and shoulders, while the lamp above the compartment burned lower and softer, making the brass rack, the dark cloth seats, and Eleanor Wren's folded cloak seem almost part of a dream. Now and then his eyes had closed, and the sound of the wheels had changed inside his half-sleep into other sounds. Rain ticking on the glass house roof at Ashcombe, a rake drawn across gravel, Agnes setting a cup upon the kitchen table, Marion's quick young feet along the south wall path. Then the train would sway, the lamp would tremble, and he would return to the narrow compartment, to the cold window, to the little packet of seeds traveling with him toward a morning he did not yet understand. At first the change outside was almost nothing. The window was still dark, but no longer entirely black. A faint grey had entered the glass, gathering at its edges, thinning the reflection of the lamp until Thomas could see beyond his own face. The countryside began to appear in fragments. A hedge, low and wet, the pale slope of a field, a line of bare trees standing in mist, a gate opening onto a track silvered by rain. These things came and passed too quickly to be properly kept, yet each one seemed to tell him that the night was ending without asking whether he was ready. Eleanor stirred opposite him. She had not been deeply asleep either. Her notebook lay closed beside her, and one gloved hand rested upon it, as if even in rest she had kept hold of her work. She turned toward the window and watched the grey light slowly gather over the Shropshire fields. "We must be near now," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. He did not answer at once, because the word near had become larger than distance. Ludlow was near. Marion was near. The house he had never lived in, the room she had written about, the morning sun she had thought would suit him, all of it was near. And Ashcombe, though it had been left behind in the night, did not feel far away. It felt folded inside him. The walled garden, the old pear trees, the damp brick, the house with new owners, the beds that would be changed by hands that did not know why certain things had once been planted where they were. The train ran through a small station without stopping. Its nameboard passed too quickly to read, blurred by mist and speed. A porter stood beneath a yellow lamp that still burned, though daylight was coming, his coat collar turned up against the chill. A barrow waited beside him with 2 trunks and a sack of mail. For a moment, Thomas saw the scene clearly, as one sees a picture held briefly before being taken away. Then the platform slipped behind them, and the train moved back into open country. The fields were low and damp. Water lay in the furrows. Hedges shone with beads of rain. In the distance, a few cottage roofs appeared through the pale vapor, and from one chimney, a thin line of smoke rose straight into the still air. It was the hour when kitchens were being opened, when fires were coaxed back to life, when hands reached for kettles and shutters were drawn aside. At Ashcombe, this would have been the hour when Thomas stepped out before anyone else, knowing the garden by smell before he saw it. Here, there was no garden waiting for him, no key in his hand, no gate that knew his touch, only the cloth bag beneath his palm, and somewhere ahead, Marion. Eleanor began to gather her things. She placed her pencil inside the notebook, tied the narrow ribbon around it, and tucked it into her leather bag. Her movements were careful, unhurried, as if she understood that any suddenness would disturb the stillness that had settled between them. "I shall not forget Ashcombe Blush," she said. Thomas looked down at the bag. "It may never come to anything. It may not. And if it does, it may not be the same rose." "No," Eleanor said. "It may not." There was comfort in the way she did not pretend otherwise. Thomas had heard many kinds of consolation in his life, most of them kindly meant and useless. But Eleanor's words did not cover the truth. They simply stood beside it. After a while he said, "I thought I was bringing Marion the last of Ashcombe." Eleanor looked at him, but did not interrupt. "Now, I think perhaps that is too heavy a thing to bring a daughter at dawn." A faint smile touched her face, not cheerful exactly, but warm. "Perhaps you might bring her only the seeds." Thomas looked toward the window again. Only the seeds. The phrase seemed small enough to carry. He could offer them without demanding that Marion become the girl who had once run along the gravel path. He could show her the packet without asking her to love the old garden in the exact shape of his grief. If she had a wall, perhaps they might try. If she had no wall, perhaps a pot would do. If she did not want them, that too would have to be allowed. A life could not be forced to bloom backward. The train began to slow. It was a slight change at first, only a lengthening in the sound of the wheels, a gentler pull through the carriage. Then the hedges outside moved more slowly, and the fields gave way to the first edges of the town. Thomas saw a row of back gardens, narrow and damp, with washing lines bare in the morning air. A low stone wall darkened by rain, a shed roof patched with moss, a small yard where a woman in a shawl stepped out with a coal scuttle in her hand. Beyond these came rooftops, chimneys, and the pale suggestion of a church tower rising through mist. Ludlow. He had seen the name on Marian's letters for years. It had lived on paper, neat and distant. Now it was stone, smoke, wet slate, morning breath, and unknown windows. Eleanor drew on her gloves. I hope it will be a gentle morning with your daughter. Thomas held the seed bag a little closer. I do not know what she will want, he said. No, I do not know whether there is room for an old gardener. Eleanor fastened the last button of her glove. You may not know that today. The train slowed further. A signal passed the window. Then came a cutting, damp stone, close on either side, and after it the platform appeared, long and wet under the early light. The station lamps were still burning, their yellow glow fading in the grey-blue dawn. Steam drifted along the carriages in soft white clouds. Somewhere a porter called to another man. Somewhere farther off, a horse shifted against its harness, and the faint sound of wheels came over the stones. Thomas rose carefully. His knees were stiff. His back ached from the night's sitting. He reached for his satchel, settled it over his shoulder, and then checked, almost without thinking, that the cloth bag was safe beneath his coat. Eleanor stood too, giving him room in the narrow compartment. For a moment, they faced one another without speaking. Then Eleanor said, "Good morning, Mr. Elwood." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Good morning, Miss Wren." It was a simple farewell, but it held more than the words. It held the black window of the dining car, the cold corridor after midnight, the seeds in his palm, and the thought that what ended in one place might not have to remain only an ending. The compartment door opened. Cold station air entered, carrying the smell of coal smoke, wet wood, damp stone, and morning bread from somewhere beyond the platform. Thomas stepped down slowly, one hand on the rail. The platform was still half empty. A porter moved past with a trolley. A woman in a dark bonnet stood near the shelter. A boy waited beside a stack of luggage, peering along the train as if searching for someone. Thomas looked once down the platform, then again, but he did not yet see Marian clearly. He stood with the satchel against his side, and the seeds held close. He did not know whether Marian would want to plant them. He did not know whether Ashcombe blush would ever grow. He did not know how to belong to this new morning. But as the steam thinned and Ludlow opened around him in grey light, Thomas understood one quiet thing. A garden could end in one place and still leave behind something that asked, patiently, for soil elsewhere. And now, as the story reaches the place it was always meant to find, everything grows quieter. The lamp in the old room burns low, leaving only a small circle of light upon the table. Outside, the village road rests beneath the mist. The rooftops are dark, the windows are closed, and all the sounds of the day have faded into a soft and gentle silence. There is nothing more that needs to be explained. Nowhere else you need to go. Only the last warmth of the room, the distant sound of the wind, and the peaceful feeling of night settling over everything. You can let your shoulders soften, let your hands rest, let the story drift away little by little as sleep comes closer, slowly, quietly, sleep.